So I want to talk to you about Singapore. I just finally met one Singaporean. The point of this video is actually to point out that all morning I was walking around, exercising, so on and so forth, and I did not meet a single Singaporean. The lady behind me is a stay-at-home mom. Now, you might think to yourself, well, wait a second, it's 10 a.m., all the Singaporeans are at work. In fact, last night I got a foot massage. The lady was Vietnamese. If you go outside over here, all the workers that are doing the construction are from Bangladesh or India, Pakistan. Now, the problem is in America, see, this is what people in Singapore don't understand. In America, I would be able to walk into a grocery store at 10 a.m. or 11 a.m. and I would be able to meet somebody, right, who's American. And over here, there's a grocery store that's right over there. And guess what? The people in the front are most likely from Malaysia, and they're over here because of the stronger currency. The people in the back would be from China. So ultimately, right, it's not the same. And a lot of people from Singapore just don't quite understand that. And what's really happening here is an immigration issue that most politicians are afraid to touch because it is a lightning rod. I'm an immigrant. I think that this morning I met somebody. Let me give you an example of what happens when you have this sort of an unequal or imbalanced labor market. I get up in the morning and go outside, and then, like I said, people in the front of the grocery store, they're all going to be, for the most part, from Malaysia. Now, that doesn't mean they're Malay. They could be Indian. Malaysia is extremely diverse. But again, they would not be from Singapore. In America, it would be a teenager. But the Singaporean teenagers are so well off, for the most part, that they wouldn't be wasting, quote unquote, wasting their time in a grocery store in a suburb. They'd be out there taking lessons or, they'd be doing something else. And again, it doesn't matter if I'm there at 10 a.m. or 10 p.m. There is not a single teenager working at my local grocery store in Singapore, in a suburb in Singapore. So, when you talk about immigration, there are obviously benefits, but in the morning you go down there, again, no Singaporeans working there. A lot of people here are a bit older, right? There's a demographic challenge. And again, you've got a situation where, a lot of the workers will be coming from a different country, but the demographic problems that you look at, they have consequences. And people are talking about these consequences at a very high level, very sort of eagle-eye view. But the reality on the ground is that you can actually be in Singapore and really just never meet a Singaporean. And, so I go over here because of the demographic problem. Many people who live here they have Filipino maids. What's happening now is that the maids are coming, or the helpers are coming from Myanmar. And the Filipinos, this is a bit confusing for someone like me because I would assume the helper would be from the Philippines, so I would say hello to somebody. And, the person from Myanmar, they don't speak English at all, for the most part, right? And, so they'll say, hello. I said, are you Filipino? Yes. Are you from Cebu? Yes. And what's Cebu? Oh, wait. So on, Visayas, so on and so forth. So you end up feeling, if you are a Singaporean, like that lady over there is a stay-at-home mom, very nice. They're quite busy, right? You've got 2 kids. She's got 2 kids that she's raising. And as a result, you don't really have a system where perhaps you feel as a citizen isolated in your own country. But in fact, and this is really sort of the downside here, if you're the Prime Minister Wong, a perfectly reasonable person, perfectly nice person, you're probably not going to come to a suburb like this. You're going to be out there working on billion-dollar deals. You're not going to be out here in a relatively less well-off district. You're going to delegate. You're going to be concerned with the big issues. But in fact, that kind of an attitude is precisely what voters all over the world are rebelling against. They don't necessarily care as much anymore about, the Prime Minister or the President getting a handshake from Biden, from Xi, from Putin, from whatever, right? Somebody in the EU. They don't care about those photo ops anymore, about that international prestige, despite the fact that we're now more globalized than ever before. What they really want is for someone like that, someone in power, to come over here and just sort of see what's going on. But you can see again, if you are a prime minister, why would you come here? And certainly, they're like, well, there are think tanks, there are academics. But, I do meet Singaporean academics, and almost always the smartest ones are very well off. And so I'll meet them at a conference, and that's all. They're not going to come over here. And because they are very well off, Singapore rewards intelligence, they're not going to be able to discuss something like this at a grassroots level. So suddenly you have, suddenly you have basically a disconnect that is only identifiable by people in power at a high level, and not, wait a second, how did it get to the point where a Singaporean is really quite isolated in his or her own country? And you think about Japan, you're like, wait a second, this is interesting, right? Now, maybe the Japanese are aware of this issue and they want to control immigration as much as possible. So bottom line is, the immigration issue is complex. What you need is someone to point out that the issue is complex, that there isn't necessarily an upside or a downside. Because if you do end up suddenly deporting everyone here, and all of them are legal for the most part, I assume, well, you have a massive labor imbalance. The labor shortages, prices would go up, and everything else. But no one's really discussing these issues logically, because again, the prime minister is somewhere else dealing with billion-dollar issues. But what affects people on a domestic level, all these issues are far more prosaic. And what's happening now is the politicians are trying to buy people off. So they might, spend money. This is a community center. They might give this community center more money. That community center will have more events. And so there's like a dance class of some sort over here in the morning. That's where I met the maid from Myanmar sitting outside waiting for her, for her boss. You've got all these other issues coming in. These are issues that, again, are really sort of supply demand. There's an upside and a downside to having a society like this. But if you can think of it differently, where you would look at it and say, well, wait a second, people are taking over the country. Now there's a gap, right? You don't have people at the grassroots level trying to explain to you what it's like, being in this kind of a situation with an immigration imbalance because of a wealth imbalance. And so if you don't have that, and remember, Singapore is highly organized. It has to be small. So it has to be essentially, in a sense, when it comes to real property, has to be, in a sense, top down. It has to be very well organized to be as successful as it has been. And again, you can see that even when you succeed beyond your wildest dreams, you can still fail. And that is kind of interesting in terms of a balance, in terms of equilibrium. So what's really happening here, you don't know. When I go on Netflix, or I don't really go on television anymore, I go online, no one's really discussing these issues. They don't come in and say, well, this is what happened, this is what it's like. What can we do without trying to pay people off or pay off, local community centers? What can we do to perhaps try to fix these issues? What's happened in the United States is that, now people are simply just sort of throwing darts at each other, right? Well, wait a second, America first, and, they've got these slogans. And in fact, the situation is extremely complex. And you don't really have anybody anymore who can come in and say, well, listen, it's not just an American problem, it's a global problem. How can we sort of sit down and try to make sure everyone's voices are being heard? How can we try to make sure that the elites that run these places so well are going to be also able to hear possible issues happening in places that they don't necessarily visit frequently?